called Bill Gothard and made sure it was the right thing to do. We're facing tremendous opposition today, not from the government. I don't think that's where our major problem is going to come from in the near future. Maybe in the long term, but not in the near future. Let me take you over to 2 Timothy and chapter 3. 2 Timothy chapter 3. I'm totally unconcerned about what your eschatological bent is this morning. It says, in the last days, perilous times shall come. Whatever your definition of last days is, I really don't care. I will tell you this, the perilous times are upon us. And what he lists here in 1 Timothy chapter 3, we are seeing around us, and they're going to affect us. Please notice, first of all, in verse 2, he says, well, let's start at verse 1. This know also that in last days perilous times shall come, for men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous. Covetous. We're in a situation, certainly in our day, where the church is, or where the government covets power over the church. They're using the 501c3 to covet the property of the church. And I'll tell you what's going to happen here. This is you can write this down. All these churches are going out here and getting their 501c3 status, and they're doing their whole song and dance and all this kind of stuff. And they got their tax deduction and tax exemption, so they're building these big buildings and buying up this property and so forth. And one day the government's going to say, you know what, we can't afford for you folks not to pay taxes anymore. And they can't pay property tax on a basketball stadium in Houston. They can't pay property tax on hundreds and thousands of acres and buildings and so forth. And the church will, and the government will end up with the church's property. I really like the zoning requirement thing. Folks, let me just say this. Get these churches out here and they're going to, well, the Lord has opened this opportunity and called us over here, and we're going to do this, that, and the other thing. We're going to go check with the zoning board, because here's the thing. 5 unsaved guys on the zoning board know more about the will of God for my church than the pastor. We had a situation years ago in Buffalo, New York. The guy felt led of God to open a church in downtown Buffalo, in the area where all the homeless and the drunks are and so forth. Got himself a storefront, started a church. Wasn't long before the government came in and said, "Oh, you don't have an occupancy permit." So he contacted CLA. CLA contacted the county and asked for a 30-day extension. Talk about taking that stand. Asked for a 30-day extension. They raised $30,000 to refurbish the building. They wouldn't give him an occupancy. Now remember, this guy feels called of God to go to downtown Buffalo to minister to the homeless and the drunks and that kind of thing in downtown Buffalo. Next little newsletter that comes out has a big headline that says, "Victory in Buffalo." I was excited. I thought, this is great. But until you read the story, a Seventh-day Adventist church in the suburbs had opened up their building to allow him to meet in it, so he was now meeting 14 miles away from downtown Buffalo. And all those homeless people and all those drunks, I'm sure, were just driving right on out there. Verse 2 says that they will not only be covetous, but he said that they'll be unthankful and unholy. Unholy. Righteous and godly practices will become less and less acceptable. Our arguments of righteousness and godliness and biblical truth will become less and less acceptable. And Christian stance is going to at some point become ineffective in legal and societal terms, that's when we're going to have to learn to just trust the Lord. The Bible says that they'll be disobedient to parents. And what that indicates to me is that we're going to be in a society that is not going to be sympathetic with parental authority. We're going to be in a society that's not going to be sympathetic to godly discipline. We're going to be in a society that's not going to be sympathetic to homeschooling and Christian schools. We are experiencing a great explosion today. And there is a danger, so if you're homeschooling, pay attention. Back some years ago, Michigan was the absolute worst state in the Union for homeschooling. It was a disaster. 2 cases came before the Supreme Court, the Bennett case and the DeYoung case. Mike Ferris was representing both and used the argument that Bennett's had a right to educate their children under the First Amendment as applied to the states by the 14th Amendment under the Yoder case. It was a stance that had lost in 7 other Supreme Courts, but figured might as well try it in Michigan. The other crowd, DeYoung, said, no, we're not going to use that. We don't care about that. I'm the father. I have a responsibility to educate my children. I can't give that responsibility to anybody else. I have to do this whatever happens. The Supreme Court, we said at the time, Bennett will lose, DeYoung will win. 6 months later, the Supreme Court came down and said to Bennett, you are not Yoder, put your kids in the public school or else. And then Justice Kavanaugh from Michigan wrote the most magnificent decision I wish I had written it on the subject of homeschooling and said, we cannot ask a person to choose between obedience to their God and obedience to the state. And Michigan became the freest state in the Union for homeschooling in that one sweep. Okay? The outgrowth of all of that has been in states all around, the state says, listen, we respect your right to homeschool your kids. So all we're asking you to do, send us a little form, let us know what your kids' names are, and let us know what curriculum you're using, and sometimes in the year we'd like to see what they're, and that's it. You know, you're welcome to do this. We want you to have this freedom. We got homeschoolers just sending in their little paperwork and sending in their little paperwork and sending in their little paperwork, and they call us and we say, don't send in your paperwork, but they send in their paperwork because they think that we're some kind of idiots. Listen to me carefully. If I go to the state of California and I say, please, is it okay with you if I educate my children? And they say, yes, you may do that. I now have their permission. Next year they say, you know what? We have found a real problem with this homeschooling thing. We decide you can't do this anymore. Now I want you to listen to me. Not only is that a major problem for you, it is a major ethical problem for you. Because you have asked their permission and recognized that they have a right to tell you yes or no. And when you accept their yes, you really are obligated to accept their no.
There you go.
It's great, you know. See, folks, listen. Submission begins where agreement ends. Mark that down.